Yeah, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, dear friends. It's a great pleasure to welcome you in this makeshift ambience of the maybe and hopefully future Goethe Institute. This old building, which was first the private house of a rich Chinese family in the 20s and 30s, became then the seat of the independence movement of Aung San, the anti-fascist People's Liberation Front. And that was the seat up to the 50s. After that it became the art school, the official art school of Yangon of Myanmar, till last year when the Ministry of Culture has offered us this place as a future seat of the German Cultural Center of the Goethe Institute. Since 1 year we are talking about small details of the agreement. I'm quite hopeful that we can sign this agreement finally, eventually, now, maybe, hopefully, till the end of the year. And after that we can make our programs a little bit more official and prominent than we do it now. It is still now it is a kind of informal and unofficial meeting what we are doing. The house itself forces us to look back to the history of Myanmar and to the history of the art in Myanmar, and that's what we want to do tonight. There's little written and has little been spoken about the art history of Myanmar, the early modern movements in Myanmar, and I'm very glad to welcome tonight an expert for Southeast Asian art history, that is Werner Kraus from Passau, in the south of Germany. He has dedicated great part of his life to the study of early modern art in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesian early art. We have done together a great exhibition on Raden Sali. One can say the first modern artist, first modern Asian painter in the first half of the 19th century, who became a master, was 20 years in Europe, and then he continued his career in very successful career in Java. And based on this study of the artist Raden Sali, he was looking around to the other countries, to Thailand, to southern China, to the Philippines, with this strong Catholic Spanish influence, and to South India. And that is the content of tonight, the topic of tonight, that he will present his first reflections on that, what is modern art in Myanmar. He told me I have more questions than ready places on that, what is modern art in Myanmar, that he wants to enter into a dialogue with you and to discuss the questions he has developed in the past month with his studies on Myanmar. Werner, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in Myanmar. Last time I've been here maybe 20 years ago, and I already noticed all the changes, and I'm very pleased in the changes I've seen over the last couple of days, and I hope the country will develop along this way for the next 2, 3, 4 generations. Because Werner has a grand history, huge history, also in the arts. And we will have a good future. That's all. I'm talking about the early Burmese art, but I'm not talking about Bagan or something like that. I should have said early modern Burmese art. I'm interested in this 20 or 30 years between the last years of the monarchy, which ended in 1885, 86, and the first year of the 20th century, the time when a Burmese modern art movement developed. And as Safa mentioned already, I was interested in this kind of period before in other countries in Southeast Asia. Because I think this is so important, this change from a very traditional culture into a modern culture. What happened to the Burmese people? And it's so difficult to research, because there's hardly any documents on that. The only documents we have are visual documents. We have paintings, we have drawings, we have murals. And though we have to work around these documents, and I hope that some of my ideas developed over the last months, which I would like to share with you, are understandable and acceptable. If not, if you think this is all boring, I also could sing a song or do some dancing moves, more interesting. But maybe it is interesting to think a little bit about early modern Burmese art. If you look back at the history on the art history in Burma, we can see that this country has been very lucky. It's lucky because of this Buddhist tradition. Buddhist tradition in Southeast Asia is always responsible for stone buildings. You have temples, you have monasteries. That means you have walls, stone walls. And stone walls invite artists to do something about it. In other parts of Southeast Asia, like in Indonesia, you didn't have things like that. Architecture there was wooden architecture, or you had no walls at all, because it was open spaces. And of course, this was responsible for the development of the Indonesian art. The only stone walls we have in Indonesia, only a few stone mosques there, and mosques are, of course, not the kind of buildings off limits for any kind of artist intervention. Besides the stone walls and the Buddhist monasteries and temples, we also have a tradition which during the 9th century became very known. The tradition of the Karapai is books, kind of folded books, illustrations painted on paper. This is something we do not have in large parts of Southeast Asia either. In the traditional way of creating manuscripts in the larger part of Southeast Asia was writing on palm leaves. And writing on palm leaf is difficult for an artist to do illustration, because the palm leaf is very coarse and you cannot work on it like on paper. So this was the second advantage we had here from the historical time. The big difference between the development of the arts in Burma and in places like Thailand, Philippines or Indonesia is history. And the big similarities between Burmese art, Thai art, Indonesian art is history again. And tonight I would like to look more at the similarities, historical similarities, and not at the differences between these different Southeast Asian nations. In the context of South and East Asia, what do you mean by that? Usually, the art histories of Asian countries have been written by foreigners, Americans, Australians, Europeans. And they tended to look through this European spectacles. Because of that, we all believe modernity in Southeast Asian art was more or less the result of imperialism, of colonialism, of cultural contacts between local cultures and European American cultures. I'm not interested in that so much. I would like to look at it from a different perspective and find out. And as Xaver mentioned already, everything is still hypothetical. The answers are not really avoidable. But I would like to find out how the communications between Southeast Asian nations, between Southern Chinese ports, between India and Burma, how through this kind of communication a new idea of modernity developed. So modernity as a result of communication among Asian countries and not so much transformed communication, transformed ideas from the west to the east, this one-way traveling of ideas. Burma is a relative latecomer when it comes to the development of Asian modernities. Of course, during the 19th century, the Kingdom of Burma had to fight 3 wars against the British imperialism. The forward movement of the British in Burma was very strong and very pressing, so they really wanted to control this country. So the Burmese had little time, little opportunity to think about, as it happened in Thailand, about reforms or in Japan, and move on into the modern world. This is one of the big disadvantages of this country. If you think about Mongkut, the king of Thailand, and his counterparts here, Mindong and Tipor, totally different. The people here did not have the space to move, did not have the time to develop new ideas, to move onwards because of the British pressure, which was not there in Thailand. I mentioned it already that much of the idea I offer tonight to you are still highly hypothetical. I regard them as an approximation, the first approximation. I more or less throw some bones around me and hope that we pick them up and join them together and maybe find out more than I can offer in that discussion. In order not to make it too complicated, or the cultures are very complicated matter. They're all part of huge networks. But in order not to make it too complicated, I picked 3 aspects I would like to talk about three aspects. The first is the importance or non-importance of Chinese and Southeast Asian trade art, the development of modernism in Vietnam. The term trade art, I know I have to explain later. The second point is I would like to talk about Thai mural art as a possible source of influence on Burmese mural art, or the other way around. Was it the Burmese mural tradition that influenced modern Thai mural art? And the third point, I hope we have done enough to go to the third point, is the impact of photography on modern Burmese art. And this is, I think this is very special. The impact of photography has been profound everywhere in Asia, but especially, I believe, especially profound in Burma. First, let me talk about the Chinese trade art, or sometimes it's also called company art. By this we mean art produced in the ports of Canton or also in places in India for the foreign population, for the population of foreigners. Chinese artists produced paintings for the foreigners to take home, and these paintings, usually small oil paintings or painted on glass, on the reverse glass technique, these paintings were something new. They were neither Chinese nor were they European. There was a hybrid sort of art developing, and a lot of European, especially Australian art historians believe that this was the beginning of, the possible beginning of a change in Asian art. This was the beginning of modernity in the long run. So this was leading to modernity in Asian culture. Andrew Werner, he published a book called Burmese Painting about 5 years ago, and it is one of the few books, and then a few books, and I'm not talking about Burmese language books because I can read them, and I know there are a number of very good Burmese language books on Burmese art, on the development of Burmese art, already written in the 80s and 90s. Werner used most of them in his book, and he mentions in a side note that the last Burmese court painter, Sayachon, he lived between 1866 and 1970, and he was the person placed in this area we are talking about. He was trained as a traditional court painter, and still he is the father of modern Burmese art at the same time. So this guy with the two faces, very, very important figure in Burmese art history. And Andrew Werner mentions that he also did oil paintings on glass. Oil paintings on glass, by this he means reverse paintings on glass. This is an old tradition. It was brought by the Jesuits to China, and in the 16th, 17th century in the European countries, a very highly developed technique. You paint on glass, and you have to paint it in the reverse way. So what you usually see on top of a painting, of an oil painting, you have, as an artist, you have to do first. You build it up the other way around. It's very tricky, very difficult. But it's also very, very beautiful, very intriguing, because the glass gives you the impression that you, as a viewer of the painting, as a beholder, you're part of it, because you see yourself in the painting all the time. This is, if you have seen this glass painting, this is really something else. It's totally different from looking at a painting all on canvas than one of these glass paintings. And another good thing about the glass painting, you cannot reproduce it. You cannot make prints of it. How do you print a glass? This is not possible. And the Jesuit brought this technique to China, but the Chinese developed it to perfection. And especially in the southern ports, where the traders from America and the European countries were living and doing their business. Though these glass paintings were exported not only to European countries and to the Americas, but, and this is a new insight, we didn't know that before, they were exported to Asian countries as well, to Southeast Asian countries as well. Here, this is so-called trading art drawings, and you see the Chinese, how he copies a European print on a real glass. So he transforms it into a reverse glass painting. Luckily enough, it was documented by the Chinese himself. And these paintings then were sold for fairly large prices to different ways. Here we have an Indian miniature from Surat. And see, on the wall of this Indian courts, you have Chinese reverse glass paintings. So already in the second half of the 18th century, these paintings were exported to India as well. And by this time, this was the native courts, was not colonized yet. Here you have George Washington. And again, this was in Udaibu in Rajasthan. All in these places, they already bought Chinese art. And we also know that in Kandy, in Sri Lanka, that in Buddhist temples in Bangkok, in Chinese temples in Medan, in North Sumatra, this sort of paintings turned up, and they influenced the local cultures quite well. Since we are here in the coming Goethe Institute, I have to mention a story. I have to tell you a story. Because one of the topics of Chinese reverse glass painting was the figure of Werner. Goethe wrote a very famous novel, The Sorrows of the Young Werner, Die Leiden des jungen Werner. It was an international bestseller. It was translated in all languages, European languages, all the European languages. And in one of his poems, Goethe in one of his poems, he complained about the fact that not only the British publisher never paid him a single penny for the translated copies, but even the Chinese company are using this version now and are not going to pay anybody for it as well. So he was informed about the fact that the young Werner was reproduced by the Chinese, like the portraits of George Washington. Werner was a very famous figure at this time, and everybody knew him by his brown bands, his blue jacket, and his white shirt. So this was the colors of Werner. The court in Mandalay and maybe a number of monasteries in Upper Burma certainly owned Chinese reverse glass paintings as well. When Michael Symes visited Ava in 1795, was the first embassy of the British to do the court in Ava, he was offered by King Min a reverse glass painting, but this painting already was done by a court painter. Though they had imported Chinese reverse glass painting, and then local court painters copied. And by this time, in 1795, the court painter was a Siamese, a Thai, not a Burmese. You have to remember that after the fall, after the destruction of Ayutthaya through the Burmese armies, they brought back all the Thai parties to the court in Ava. And these people were still alive. And these people apparently had already experience with this reverse glass painting in Ayutthaya, though they were very influential in transformation, in early transformation of Burmese art as well. I mentioned that the father of modern Burmese art, Daya Chu, he tried himself in reverse glass painting as well. And the question is, why did he do that? What did he see? Why did he want to dabble in this art? I think what he was interested in, that he saw landscapes without religious implications. He saw individual portraits without idealization. He saw everyday life scenes. And this was modern, this was very modern at this time, because everything else produced as art in this part of the world always connected with religion. Almost nothing outside the religious context. So this was a new beginning. This is why this was so successful in this part of the world. Besides, the street art was not only glass painting. Besides the glass painting, another important section of the street art was the so-called costume books. These were paintings, drawings done by local people, influenced by European art practices. Again, this hybrid thing. And these albums were taken home by Europeans, or they were collected by local peoples as well. They were kind of anthropological drawings, and as such of interest as well, because science and art came together. An old European theme during the 18th century. And I will just show some of them. These are costume books from China, different professions. Then we have costume books in the Philippines. The famous Damian Domingo, one of the first known Philippine painters at the beginning of the 19th century, he did whole series of these costume books as well. They're extremely expensive always. Then we have a costume book from Bangalore in South India. Again, different professions, different religions, clothing. Here we have an Indonesian version done by Ratsal, by Werner. At this time, Ratsal was only 12 years old. So we have different of mention from West Java. Yeah. And this is another sort of radar. This is this landscape. This is this island in front of Kandron, a very tiny little island where the foreigners had to live. They were not allowed to leave this small island. And these houses are the trading houses of the different European and American houses. If you look at this painting and compare it with the next one, this was done by Sayatun. It's called the Attack on Java. It was done in the 8th century. So you can see already the connection. The way he treats landscapes, the way he treats the structures. It's very much connected to the Spanish way of doing paintings. We don't have any European or British or models. The model is definitely the Chinese model. And it is for the Burmese project, this is modern art. This was modern art. It was a complete reach with the tradition. What is here, you don't have any angels in the sky or whatever. You have a real sky, you have real trees, you have photos, you have a river, you have British boats and British army or navy firing at the photos of lava. Actually, it was this painting that brought me the idea to look at the connection between trade art and early Burmese painting. There was, in the 70s, there was a top expert on trade art and company painting. Her name was Mildred Archer, an English art historian. And she claimed that because Burma was, the inclusion of Burma into the art was so late, no company painting developed here in this country, because Burma was a late country. But we have to take it with a grain of salt, since Archer argues from the perspective of British library holdings only. According to my research, artworks in the company painting style were known in Burma as well. We know a number of costume books which have been produced in this country. The first are not by Burmese artists, but by Indian, but later on also by Burmese artists. As an Indian, his name was Singai Bey from Calcutta, and he was traveling along with Michael Symes, 1795, to Ava, and he was the first to produce Burmese costumes. This is not the original drawing by him, but this is already an illustration which was done by an engraving by an English artist. But this gives us a good idea on how art used to travel at this time. The first step was that Singai Bey did a drawing of Burmese Navy. The second step was there was a British artist from Goethe was his drawing, and it was an illustration used for the book of Michael Symes, published in 1800. In the same year, a German translation And now we have different illustrations for this book done by a certain C.C. Glasbach. And you already see that there are certain changes. It's much more elaborate than the dress, although the pattern is different from the original pattern. And a couple of years later, an Italian scholar, he wrote a book on the costumes in history and all around the world, about 21 volumes, and he included the costumes of our as well, when he went back to the Germany. If you look at the pattern of the Saran, this is exactly taken by the German model. And what he did, this Italian artist, this woman now is clearly standing on her right foot, while she is standing on both feet. And she's standing on her right foot, and then develops this S, this curve, which has to be, this is part of European academic art, academic painting. A woman that is not developed, this S is not available. Though starting out from Indian artist who was a little bit influenced by European art. This was therefore to the continent, to the British engraver, to the German artist, and to an Italian. And for me, this is a beautiful document on circular culture movement. And up to now, we always have the idea that everything traveled from west to east. But here it's Burma. The original was done here in Burma. And then it traveled to England, to Germany, to Italy. So we have Indian, Asian influence on German, Italian, English art as well. And this is, for me, this is what makes this documentation so interesting. In the 20th century, just to show them paintings. This is a Burmese costume group. If you compare it with the Indian, big similarities, yeah? And then in the 20th century, we have some costumes in the mark, people, the minor people, they were produced in Burma, and they were produced by people by the artists from the Black nation as well. Certainly we have some development of costume groups in Myanmar as well. I think it would be a good idea for Myanmar art historian to look more into the details and find out if there are any illustrations with Chinese reverse paintings on the wall, like we have seen in the Indian context, and try to find more documentation in there. You have to live in this country, but we have to be interested in your national art history to do this kind of work. This cannot be done by people from other places. But it would be worthwhile, and it would be a good topic of dissertation to work on the sea. I certainly would like to support you. I would like to help you if you would like to think that way. Now let's move to another point. Let's move to Burmese murals and in comparison with the Thai. Werner's murals were highly developed during the Bagan era. Over a long time, the technique, the style, and the topic remained rather stable. It was only in the 18th century, around 76 to 77, that a complete new type of murals emerged. I'm talking about, this is the traditional mural. You look at the building and you see the wall. And the perspective means nothing. Then the first revolution was that the bird's eye view was introduced. Now you look from a high point and suddenly you see the whole building without using European perspective. This is another way of creating complete vision. This was very much Chinese and Thai. It was developed in Thailand. And the first time we see it here in Werner was in, I'm looking for the name of the temple, the Ananda Okyo in Baga temple. Was built in 1786. And we know, I mentioned it already, at this time there are artists called the Thais. The Thai artists taken from Malaysia to this country, they were the Thai tradition, the Thai perspective, this worldwide perspective to this country, and introduced it, and it was very, very successful. You see also traditional cultures are open for innovation. The idea that tradition is traditionally always remains the same. This is not true. All the traditional cultures were open to innovations if there was a good reason to it. And this certainly was a good reason, because the story is now much more lively, there's much more movement in it. There's a possibility to create movement in such a space, which is not possible if you have just a flat representation of a story. And then a second revolution happened in the middle of the 19th century. Only about 50 years, 60 years later, a completely new type of wall painting emerged, a new type of mural emerged in Burma, this time in Amarura, on the inner wall of the Kyoto temple. These murals now show realistic landscapes. Here you see the landscapes of Upper Burma, the arid, dry landscape of Burma. You have skies with clouds in it. Before you have a cloud, can you still have somebody flying through the air as well? But this was a complete and revolutionary reach to the old tradition again. And we, of course, show you another one. The digital upper urban landscape with these palm trees. And art historians of Southeast Asia, they know that something else, something similar happened in Thailand around the same time. Paintings done by Hua In Ung. It's one of the first individual names we have in Thailand. And suddenly you see, this is on the wall of the Buddhist temple, you see kind of European structures and hundreds of others. How come Thai artists invented this sort of background? It's because at this time American European journals, photo prints, were distributed widely in China, and they introduced into their art. And it was not by chance, because this kind of murals only happened in temples which belonged to a Reform Buddhist movement, the Dhammayunika, which was a reform movement created by Mongkut. When King Mongkut was still a monk, he was one of the biggest reformers of the Buddhism, with a more rational Buddhism. They were not so much involved in mystical thinking. And this Dhammayunika was very much supported by the royalty, so they had enough money to build a number of temples in Bangkok. Pyramids are still there. This one was built in Malaysia, but also in Bangkok. And there was plenty of space for this new type of murals. Here you have everything you could call a modern way. You have a perspective, you have shading, you have volume, so everything is almost already there. Here again we have this strange structures. I don't know which part of the world in 1850 this kind of buildings existed. It looks more like the 20th century. Maybe it was just an invention. But as I said, they have a lot of material. Now, everybody believed that the Burmese, this very style of murals was influenced by the Dai, Yu Tai Newfen, by Hua Kong and his school. Well, if you look at the historical dates, you find out this is earlier. This is almost 10 years earlier than the Thai murals done in Bangkok and Malaysia. So actually, we could think about turning the development around, and maybe it was this time those Thai artists influenced by Burmese artists, while all the time before, the 100 years before, it was always the Thai artists influencing Burmese art. Of course, the intriguing thing of Sistines and is this little age. In the middle of this Buddhist scars, suddenly you have typical European age. And if you look at it, he is carrying a banner. And this kind of tiny little Buddhas, angels, were used in 19th century European books and journals between chapters or at the end of a book. Sometimes when there was the end on this banner. No? So somebody here in Monterey must have had the chance to have access to this kind of European illustrations. We are trying to make a comparison between the Thai and the Burmese models. And we think they're very similar. If you really they have basically the skies, they have the real clouds, and then the mystical figures, and the same here, the real cloud and the mystical picture between. So there must have been predictions. This is totally impossible to develop here and there at the same time without knowing of each other. Here again, young art historians stand up, do research on that. This is very worthwhile. Maybe we can go to the Thai, learn from the Burmese, and this would be a very nationalistic undertaking. You would get a star from this, from your president. Yeah, why was I interested in this sort of, it is because clearly here European methods like the vanishing point, the shaping and the giving volume to the structures was already known. Not perfectly. Look at this one here. This is the unexpected. But artists in this part of the country were willing to play around with it. They were willing to experiment. They were willing to look for new ways. And all this, again, was not introduced by Western artists. It was not introduced by imperialism or whatever. It was a local development. This kind of modernity is a local modernity. It was not imposed. For me, this is the most important thing, that we understand that we have different sort of modernism. We have the European modernity, and the European idea for a long time was everybody else was copying. We were just repeating it. This is not the case. This is totally different. There was a local development. They didn't need Europeans. They didn't need European artists to go into this kind of development. They needed some illustrations or whatever, and of course they had a different look at it than we have today. This is the most important message I want to bring to you today. That already in the 19th century, it didn't take European presence to take over certain European techniques. The essential point when we come up to the beginning of the Burmese or Southeast Asian modernities, that it was done in the home culture. In order to understand this, you have to look into local political, historical systems, in the cultural change of the time, and maybe also, since I guess I used up my time already, I just run through some pictures and photographs in the world. I mentioned it in the beginning that photographs were more important for the development of modern art in Burma than in other countries in Western Asia, because everything was so late here. Development of modern art was maybe 50 years later than in Indonesia. But already in the 1870s, we had some kind of photographs. We had a number of photographers here, but basically the two companies. One was a German company. His name was Philip Clear. He came from Penang. And the other one was Delvin. His name was Pial. Clear worked in Rangoon. Pial worked in Mandalay. Now, if you compare the paintings, this is Saya here. He was a student of one of the founding fathers of Burmese modernism. He did this painting in 1909. You see how strong it is connected to the photograph. Here again, a photograph by Clear. And here, the painting that's here. I would like to compare this painting with an Indonesian painting done by Werner in 1856, 50 years earlier. And you see the construction is very similar. very similar, because here again, photography was the model. That was, you see, the studios, they had this little tables, they had the chair object, they had the spitting, and the same in English. Here, Burmese examiners saying it, 1920, the same setup, like in the studio photograph. Here you have a Chinese Sala example, Indonesian example of Chinese gentleman, 1855, more or less the same setup again. Here again, Sala 1920. You see, it's always the same setup. It's always influenced by the photographic history, so this is a photographic culture of this country. This much earlier, again, you see the way we use the tables and instruments on the table. This is where we made it. And here we have a very special Burmese development. This painting, the face is a photograph, was cut out photograph, and the rest is an oil painting. I wouldn't know any other place in the world where this kind of technique was used. Here in Werner it was used. And I guess the reason is because it was still very difficult to paint the face. Yesterday we have been in your shop, and you showed us a painting in your session, the same sort of thing. The face cut out of the photograph, the rest is a painting. And if you compare the treatment of the hands with the face, then you understand why they cut out, they used to cut out the photograph. So the hands are very poorly taken. And if he was not good enough in painting the hands, imagine how he would have painted the face. The same painting. Very interesting development in Burmese art history. Which didn't last long, maybe 10 years, 10, 15 years. After that, the artists learned how to paint faces. And then, of course, they did not cut out photographs in the own. Here, one or two photographs. This one is done by Philip Clear, the guy came from Germany to Myanmar in 1871. He died here in Rangoon in 1911. So he spent 4 years, most of his life in this country. If you compare his photograph with the photograph of the Italian, the Felice Beata, you still can see very good resonance, historians. This is very solid. This is made in Germany. And this is Italian. Totally different. I'm sure there have been prostitutes, and he never would use prostitutes for his things. Okay, this is another research project for future Myanmar art historians, compare the different types of photographers they had in the country, and try to figure out how important the influence of photography was on the development of Burmese modern art. I think it was very important. Thank you very much.
these three interesting aspects of modern art in Burma and in Myanmar, where there are also early Burmese photographs, or was this mainly a trade of European artists? Did you find any photographs?
Well, apparently there must have been some Chinese photographs as well, but somehow they could not get enough money together to really establish these photography studios. And we have photographs of the studio of Beato studio in Mandalay. His house was much bigger than this one. It's a huge house. Well, this guy was rich, he made a lot of money doing his photographs. And apparently you had to have these houses, these studios, in order to attract customers. So we have been Chinese photographer running around the country, maybe we could not amass this capital to be successful.
Then there must have been a lot of good clients, rich clients for such photographs.
Yeah, it was basically it started out with a court, or when they came to Burma, the court was still existing. They came to Burma in 1871. Monarchy fell in 1885. But the court was still existing. And then after Deep War was taken to Bombay in India, most of the rest of them were still in the country. They were still using this kind of technique.
More questions? Yeah? And here?
Yes, I think that's really interesting. Thank you. I was interested when you said about the wall paintings on the pagodas in this country and other areas of Southeast Asia, and you mentioned that the mosques have stone walls, but obviously there's not figurative art in this form that you've shown tonight. Do you have any idea how that could be looked at or evaluated or described? The art on the walls of the mosques that exists?
I believe this is one aspect which is very often overlooked, that architecture is so important for the arts. If you go back to the European experience, look at the development of the painting in the European context, you find that it's very much connected to the development of architecture. And only in the Renaissance we had this split. Then the canvas, oil on canvas painting was introduced, was invented in Northern Europe, was taken to Italy, and in Italy they invented the perspective and these two traditions, the Northern European oil painting tradition and the Southern European invention of perspective. They came together and this new and wonderful tradition of oil on canvas painting developed. And this kind of paints, of course, are not depending so much anymore on walls. Yeah? You can put them right in the room if you want. You know? And very often it's done. But before, the beginning of art was in some caves. They used the walls of the cave, and then the architecture developed. And in places, and I think you can prove that in Southeast Asia very well. In places like Sumatra, even Java, where there are hardly any stone buildings, hardly any walls. The development painting was inhibited. It was inhibited. Only later on, when canvas and oil technology was introduced, then the new development started. But here in this country, murals existed over centuries. There was a development, people improved Very important. Yeah.
I wonder if you will see a distinction between the Burmese situation in the 19th century, which you described as being battle-fraught, and there will be possible absence of direct European influence, and a Thai situation where, of course, the Thai being small group, especially to the local, invited European cultural intervention, and I think it's fair to say what you do about Burma. I wonder if it would be as fair to say that about China, that really the Thais were not influenced by, that there was not a fairly direct influence from European art in China, which would support your argument that the Burmese were the influence of the Thais.
Well, there have been European artists in Mandalay as well, in the court of the Kongron dynasty. We know of two Italians. Unfortunately, we don't know the names. Just know there have been two Italian painters living at court Mandalay around the 1860s to 1870s. Same time when the Thai monarchies invited European artists. But as I understand it, the situation in Thailand, there was a complete split. When the Thai monarchy tried to reform, tried to stand up to European standards in order to be accepted as independent country, to be accepted as a civilized nation, you always, the European countries expected that you have to look at it like European civilization. So you needed art, you needed artists. This kind of European artists they brought to their own country was just for the outward situation. They had to prove that we can do that well. But for the inner consumption, they are still more interested in this rural art, in this Buddhist art, which was so much closer to their own culture than doing oil portraits on horseback. And the same sort of thing, I believe. Again, I don't know too much about it. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of open questions. The same sort of thing happened in Burma as well. They brought in two Italian painters in order to prove to the British, we don't have to colonize us, we are civilized. The British never that we want to colonize you because we need your teak, or we want the rise of your country. We have to come, we have to civilize you. This was the talk of imperialism. And the people understood. There's this very beautiful story about northern Ghana, about Africa, about Kumasi, the Ashanti Kingdom. The Ashanti Kingdom was independent for a long, long time, up to the 1860s. And the British put pressure on them. We want to help you, you have to civilize you. And then the king of the Ashanti asked him, what do you mean, what is civilized? And one of the British ambassadors told him, no, you have to have a museum like we have the British Museum. So the king of Ashanti invited Dutch workforce, and they built him a stone building. They built a kind of replica of the British Museum. Not very big, maybe as big as his house. And then he put some old British newspapers, some manuscripts from his Arab neighbors, and then he put in this house and said, look, we are civilized, you don't have to conquer us anymore. We have a museum. It didn't help. They had to be civilized, didn't they? But this discourse was going on between, and this discourse was going on here as well. It's not very well documented in our histories in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, this is not taken up too much. again, number 4, if you want to write a thesis, this would be a very, very interesting topic as well, the discourse between, this is also misunderstanding between the local and the foreign cultures in the context of colonization.
Questions?
Yeah.
I have some point to discuss. Okay, on Europeans, as you mentioned, comparison with Thai Europeans in photo. My idea is 1947, 1988 in Werner, let's say the King Min Zone, he hired many international staff like soldier, Armenian soldier, and also his young brother, the princess, so his younger brother, Kanal princess, Kanal prince, he sent many young people to study, like visit and something like telegraph visiting in France and the West country. And so this creations like laser cupid or angels in the sky. My idea was maybe some traveling artists or some stuff work for the king who can paint or something to make free version like them for the laser creatures. Because at the time we were very religious. This society was under religious figure, and then okay, how they come to know that they could keep it, you know? And my another point was when we approach to the modernity of art in Maro, we should also study a little bit about literature. For example, we have bagan pia iwa tamu bagan pia iwa nisai tamu nyamen kopao and like Manzanina, Detinarco. So this kind of kingdom and era. So in literature like poetry, only in Nyaoyan era we have modern poetry. The poets started to look at the normal people life and he wrote. Before the Nyaoyan era, like again, most of the poets they worked and they saw and they lived in the palace and they wrote about the king, all his plans and fire. So I think, and my another question was that did you mention when we were painting in Ananda Ukchang Wikidam was done by the Thai artist brought by the king of Burma to Burma. Did you mention that?
Did I mention it?
Yeah, I need to talk about that.
The Ananda Ukchang.
Well, 3 questions. I hope I can answer at least 2 of them. It is true that in the late years of the Mingdong era, it was the most important Burmese rule in the 19th century. He sent a number of his family to European countries abroad to get educated. This was the Japanese, this was the Thai model. But as I mentioned before, I believe, unfortunately, this was much too late. Not because Mingdong or the Burmese kings were too stupid to understand what's going on, that they have to have this connection, but because of the historical situation. There was no room, there was no time, because they had to resist this ongoing British pressure all the time. So they had not the possibilities like the Thai royalty had, or the Japanese to build up an educated upper class. Yeah? But they did send some of the princes to Europe. And what happened there? What did they bring back? In terms of art, I don't know. So maybe you have some documents on that. But it would be very interesting to look into. Also to find out what did they bring in terms of books, in terms of illustrations, in terms of paintings? Did they bring anything like that to the country? Was it important for them? What have they seen in it? Were they interested in the arts and all that we don't know? But this, of course, is very, very important. And then also that we had this uneven development of modernity in different parts of the country. Yeah, you're right. I only can support you. I think you're right. This was the case. And of course, this was, again, was a historical situation. Lower Burma was British since 1826 or 28, and Upper Burma became a colony in 1886. So there were 60 years between, 60 years of uneven development in the country. And a lot of intellectuals or people who wanted to make it actually moved into the British part of the country because the economy was much better down here. And then in the parts of the country, they have more contact with modern developments as well. So that's why we have this very uneven development in Burma.
The question was literature. The modernity in literature.
This is, I was referring to it. The difference was developing in literature and certainly in the arts as well. The artists we were talking about, the former royal artists, after a while, many of them, or at least their students, they moved to the south as well. Mandalay, the big cultural center, was depleted over the years after the collapse of the monarchy. Any other question?
The baby was demonstrating saying we feel like a child or I feel like a child. That was to stimulation the child is the artist. The child artist.
You mean the technique, the painting?
And also the perspective.
Well, on this we have very little information. Of course, we know how they did the mural. This is easy. It's easy to find out. But then, when the big change came, first they started with watercolors. Watercolors were easy to get in Werner, not in Mandalay, but in Werner. The British culture is a watercolor culture. Wherever the British went with war, they came up for war. But at a certain stage, then we moved into oil painting. And when and how this happened, I have no idea. We have no information on it. It would be very, very interesting to find out. We know that this Javanese painter, Ravan Saleh, I mentioned it a couple of times, he bought his canvases in London. He used to live in Java. He ordered his canvases from London. So some of these canvases I have seen, they are stamped with a shop, with the stamp of a shop in London. They were imported through Singapore or from Australia into Java. I think this must have been the way the British brought the canvases to this country as well. And it would be very interesting to check these old paintings and look for the canvas stamps. Because the companies who produce canvases in London, they change their address very often, sometimes every second, third year. They change the address. And the address is on the stamp. So if you make a survey of the canvas stand, you can prove in which year this or that painting properly was painted, because the canvas stand can be dated. And okay, this is another project for a dissertation. Check your paintings in canvas stand. Where nobody does that. Nobody does that. And it's so important. And it's such a good method to get an idea about the origin and the time when these canvases were produced.
First of all, I suggest you should become a professor of fine arts and learning and become a thesis professor in order to encourage all these studies. Secondly, I have a question that goes beyond the what kind of relationship was there between Burma and Japan? It was a similarly crucial period for Japan, 1878 and its restoration. And they also see the arrival of modernity in their paintings. Was there any exchange in the relationship?
Well, as soon as the British controlled Lower Burma, the Japanese had no chance to end the country as well. But I have seen a number of photographs, I don't have it this way, but the backdrop in the studios, in the photographic studios here in Burma, are Japanese paintings, Japanese coal paintings. They use the Japanese painting in the Burma studio as backdrops. So there must have been some sort of exchange. But basically, I think, by the middle of the 19th century, Japan was so busy with itself. They did not have the resources to move in Burma. It was different to Vietnam, because there's a similar culture. The culture between Japanese and Burmese is kind of similar. But here, it was totally different.
You were mentioning Vietnam. In Vietnam, it was very important for the development of the modern painting, of the modern art, was the establishment of this French school, des Beaux-Arts. When did the British do something similar here in Burma, in Yangon, to found an art school where young people could learn the Western style of art?
Well, there was never an official art school in British time, but starting from 1911, there was a so-called Rangoon Art Club. And it was run by British amateurs, and they instructed basically English ladies, but also Burmese students. But this was on a very informal level. This was not an established art school like the Beaux-Arts in
There were a difference between the English and the French attitude towards polarization.
Yeah.
Education.
The French had this ambition to colonize and to civilize the world.
And to make Frenchmen of these people.
And through their culture, and art was one of the most important things of the 19th century in France, to be preserved. And what is funny is that till today, the poor artists in Vietnam have to paint like in the early 20th century and sit and make nude paintings and so on. But that had an was an important motivation for young Vietnamese to learn art, and maybe also to become rebels against this form of Western model, which is maybe the more important and more interesting part of it.
This is definitely a big difference between French colonialism, British and Dutch. Although the Dutch in Indonesia, they were not interested to educate any artists. But again, also in Indonesia, they had a private institution. They had what they called a Kunstring. It was an art society, mainly organized by Freemasons and the Theosophical Society, this kind of people. And they also invited local people to join them. But the state was not interested in spending money on such a stupid thing as art education.
Yeah. Continue.
Sorry, I don't like to mention. I just wondered if there wasn't an art school, if the British didn't create an art school, but they had all these companies that came and built all these great buildings, these Glaswegian Scottish businesses. Did they do this patronage thing that they did in the Italian style of supporting local artists in any way, or did they bring their own artists and just use them? I just wonder.
Would you repeat that? Because acoustic is very bad.
I just wondered, because you said there was no art school for the British artists, and yet we've seen something similar. Did the companies that came here and built these beautiful colonial buildings, did they support the art in the way that Italian patronage, you know, the patrons of the art, the wealthy companies would give local talented artists a start by, well, did that happen here, or did the British bring their own artists and just do their own landscape and portrait stuff?
Well, as far as I'm informed, and I don't know too much about it, the British, there were a lot of gentlemen artists working in this country. Educated British officer or government official, he usually knew how to talk. It was part of his education. And most of them had quite a lot of free time. So many of them actually became gentlemen artists. But this was a fairly close circle. I read a number of memoirs of this British gentlemen artists, and they described that they went out into the country and they were sitting there and did some landscape watercolors, and then the local people were watching them, and they did not understand what they were doing. They could not see that this is a landscape, or that when he painted a portrait of a Burmese, and he painted it in profile, then they said, well, the second half is missing. Where's the second half of the face? So they had a totally different way of constructing picture in the brain. But this, talking about the 1880s, 1890s. And this sort of thing were reported by British gentlemen artists. But I have very little information about them educating local Burmese. The first Burmese artist who made it to Britain, he was clever enough to jump on a boat in Rangoon, work as a sailor, and went to London, and somehow he managed to join a private art school in London for a while. This was in the 1930s, very, very good.
I think CIA and also CSO used to work with the affiliation base and also break up CIA and CIA that the one who showed the lessons to the instance of both this anything already done a lot on the
Different from British. At least to learn from this Italian artist as well. I hope about this.
I could imagine that the British were surely interested in the ancient antiques,
every young German artist, or do I am I totally wrong? I don't think so. But there were collectors among British officials or traders or business people to collect early Kraus art. Is there, that would be a question to me, it would be interesting. There would be the beginning of the Burmese art business. But I don't think that it was there before the 40s or the 30s.
That's about the collection of the other things, like just only the after the mainly it's like political reason. Political reason is like you want to know about Burmese custom and all, and also like a system. So this has made a lot of the wise man to act and collect. So the wise man also acts Burmese artists to paint, and then it's like collect and collect. So that's only it is like after the annexation to Burma and after 1886. So they did a lot of like a workshop and also gather and collect a lot about the Burmese custom and laws and most of the society system. So this is the only time and this is the first time they collect. And also until now in England there are a lot of collection of these in there.
Yeah, great fields for research and for studies. And, I think that is the main impression you have given in your talk. Some red lines are there, but a lot to fill. Sebastian?
In Thailand, we talk about Goethe, the painter, that in the Lama form. And so he got the time Thai monarchy, they invite the Italian painter to painting in the palace. And so the Goethe in Thailand was art school too. If you want to go to study in drawing, you have to go to be a monk or to go to because on both of the artists to be a monk. And so because they painting the history of Buddhism, the life of Buddha. And so they painting like that. So they learn how to painting from the monk. And so when the Italian come to Thailand to painting, and in Rama 5 they want to make statue, so they invite one sculptor from Italy to make more state. And that time, so he said, okay, Thailand have a talent of painting, but Thailand painting only tempera and little sculpture and bronze for Buddha and clay, and very special clay for I don't know, they make this sugarcane clay mix and make pebble. And when the his name is philosophy something, I forget that. And so he said, okay, he want to study academic in Thailand. And so he started university, like a small school for art for young people. So they have a school of art. So it maybe just 17 years, 18 years ago. In Thailand.
Okay. Yeah. For the moment, we might not have some refreshments outside. If somebody has still the patience to listen to a discussion planning on archiving art in Asia.